Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Sorry for
The
the
broadcast
surprise.
is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hopefully you guys can all hear me. I'm also hoping that the people who had the webinar before this do not kick us off. But if for some reason we get disconnected, that could possibly happen. We had some issues last time. So I hope it doesn't, and we will just begin. We should not be here the full hour, so we're okay that we're a couple minutes late. Just to make sure everybody is here and correct, it's an info session for the Farm Field Trip Grant, which is open currently and applications are due soon. So we'll have some information about when and where, and feel free to stop me to ask questions. You can use the question section on the webinar function. You can raise your hand, whatever is more convenient for you. So my name is Erica Walther. I'm the Farm to School Specialist. You may have known me as Erica Steinhardt. I had a name change, so I just want to make sure that that is not confusing for anybody. And I am the Farm to School Specialist, like I said, at the Office of the State Superintendent of Education, who is administering this grant. So our grant period, we are going to start the grant on August 1st, 2015, and the grant period will end July 31st, 2016. The grant was announced on May 8th, and our RFA was released on May 22nd. You can currently find a copy of the RFA on our website. You can also access the actual application through the Enterprise Grants Management System, and we'll go through that as well. So the information sessions were on June 3rd and then one today. Our pre-application question period ends on June 17th. So that's an important date. So if you, I highly suggest sometime in the next week going and getting into the application and taking a look at it and making sure that you don't have any questions before you start writing. After June 17th, I'm really not allowed to answer any questions regarding the application. If there is technical issues, you can contact me and I can probably just direct you to the helpline for EGMS. Any questions that do get submitted to me through email or through the webinars will be available by June 22nd. So you can check back on the Farm to School page of the website and you can download the fact sheet. And I will email out a copy of this PowerPoint when we're finished. So your applications are due on July 1st, 2015. No later. We can't take late applications. So please make sure that you get them in by then. We're giving plenty of time. This is a smaller grant, so we really want to give schools a lot of opportunity, but just please mark that date, July 1st. And then the awardees will be announced hopefully by August 1st. We have had some delays recently, and so I want to make sure that I do warn you that if you don't hear by August 1st, you may hear in a couple days after that, but we're going to do our best to stay on time. Okay, so participating in farm field trips is a core component of the Farm to School program here at OSSE, and we really created this grant because we found out that schools were having financial issues with being able to send their students on farm field trips. As the Farm to School specialist, I believe that these field trips are really important for the schools. Depending on your school and where you work, sometimes farm to school is not the most important, and so the field trip money may not be allocated towards that. So we really wanted to make it accessible to all schools. And as many of our programming, the funding for this grant is through the Healthy Schools Act. So some information. Eligibility. So all DC public and public charter schools are eligible to apply. K through 12 teachers can apply in conjunction with central office to support a trip for their classroom. Now that's really what this grant is intended for. Some of the other grants under the Healthy Schools Act are really like school-wide grants. This is really intended for a classroom or two of students to attend a field trip. So it's more geared towards like the third graders or the fifth graders. We did have a number of schools this year that used their funding to supplement trips for more than just one class, and that's okay if you can do that, but it's not really enough money that's intended for the entire school. So just to make sure, there's a couple things that you want to make sure you're doing. All applicants have to have credentials in the Enterprise Grants Management System, which is the new online system that we're using through OSSE for grants. So if you haven't experienced EGMS, I highly suggest that as soon as we're done this webinar, you go onto the website and you put in a request to get credentials if you're eligible for that. And we'll talk about eligibility for credentials. It is a little bit confusing when you first get on there and just takes some getting used to. So make sure you give yourself plenty of time for that. The central data section on eGMS must be complete in order for you to submit your application. So a number of schools have filled out an application and submitted it, and then they never filled out central data, and we're not allowed to accept those applications. So please complete both of those. And then lastly, DCPS schools are not allowed to apply directly. Central office does not allow principals or teachers or business managers at each school to have their own login. So you will need to make sure you're giving central office, I think they say 2 weeks notice to apply for you for a grant. So if you're a DCPS school and you're interested in applying for a grant, the contact information for that person at central office is listed in the RFA. So please take a look at that. Okay, are there any questions on the last couple slides of information? Okay, looks like no, but I'll keep my eyes over there and see. All right, so the requirements of this grant. We have some activities and we have some reporting. So our activities, we want you to take your students on a field trip. So farms should be within 80 miles of the district. If it's 81, we'll probably be fine with that, but we really want it to be a day trip, not an overnight trip. And we don't want them to be spending the entire day on the bus. You're going to use up to 70% of the funding through this grant for your field trip. Another requirement is that you do at least one follow-up activity in the classroom, cafeteria, or garden, and that is really to extend the lessons that your students are learning on the field trip into the education space, whether it be the cafeteria, classroom, or garden. And you want to use at least 30% of your funding for that. So the way we kind of do it is up to 70% can go to the trip, and at least 30% can go to the follow-up activity. So if you're at 50-50, that's totally fine. You just want to stay within those ranges. And then the third required activity is that you have to conduct pre and post evaluations with all your participating students. So we'll send you a packet of pre-trip forms, post-trip forms, and post-follow-up activity forms. You'll have your students fill them out. You'll keep them organized, and then you'll mail them all back to OSSE. And you can actually, if you are worried about postage, feel free to write in some postage into your budget. In terms of reporting, there are 3 things that really need to happen. So 2 one-page summaries. The first one-page summary is due 30 days after you take your trip, and it's about your trip. So most of the trips are taken within a couple month time frames, and so it's really hard for me to get to see all of them, but I want to know what you did. So feel free to take pictures, write up a short blurb about, what did your students do? What did you learn? Were there any issues? What did you learn that was new about the farm? What surprised you? Just a good summary. And then the same thing after your follow-up activity is done. And we want that 90 days after the trip. So that's really saying that we want to make sure your follow-up activity is taking place 90 days after the trip. And depending on what your follow-up activity is, that's also a little flexible. If it's building a school garden and you build the garden within the 90 days and then you're continuing to use the garden, obviously that's okay. But we do want to make sure that they're happening together. And then the last thing is just documentation of all your expenses associated with the grant. When you read through the terms and conditions and your assurances, you're agreeing to keep documentation. So just make sure you're aware of all that. Okay, so funding restrictions. A little bit different this year than last if you were a grantee or you looked at the application last year. Allowable funds. So we can use the money for transportation to and from the farm. The cost of the field trip is designated by the farm. So I highly suggest you get a quote or an idea about how much it's going to cost you to go on the bus and back and how much it's going to cost you to pay the farm when you submit your application. You can use your funds for supplies and materials for the follow-up activities, and you can use your funds for food for approved uses in accordance with the language that's set forth in the RFA. So in the RFA, there are specific guidelines about what you can and cannot use the food for. So take a look at those. If you have any questions, please send them my way. That's new this year. We generally are not able to buy food, but we've kind of found some language that we're able to use so that we can allow our grantees to buy food, and just be mindful of what you're buying. You want it to be healthy, and we have that written in those guidelines. And we want to make sure that, you're buying, food for students if it's needed. So a lot of your food service companies, you're contracted, they'll provide you field trip meals, and so you don't need to buy the student's lunch. But if it's part of the trip or you want to use it as part of your follow-up activity, that's okay. So things that you can't use your funds for are buying souvenirs for your students while on the trip or paying extra chaperones. Those are things we say are not allowable. So application and scoring, and this is all written into the RFA, so you can also take a look at it, but your scores are weighted, and we use panels of 3 individuals who will be reviewing your grants, and they get this rubric pretty much for scoring your application. So they go through each section of the application where you're answering questions, and they ask themselves these questions. So for a needs assessment, did the applicant provide a clear overview of the demographic of students attending the field trip? So you'll make sure that you want to address that question in your application to the best of your ability. Certain sections are weighted a little bit more heavier than others because they're more about the actual money and not just about some of the background information. We want sustainability to play a role, but it's not the most important role, so it's a little bit less weighted than the actual implementation of the field trip and the follow-up activity, because that's where the bulk of the money is going. Okay, and then general administration. Awardees are going to be notified by August 1st. Like I said, we're going to really hope to get to that one. You're expected to respond to inquiries and requests from OSSI and the Farm to School specialists in a timely manner throughout the grant period. So we did have a couple schools this year that really just didn't respond to anything, and it's very hard to manage a grant with a number of schools when they're not responding. So just be mindful of that, and that the person that you're assigning as your contact person has the ability to do that. So just kind of think about that. And then please, make sure you're reading through the corrective action and termination of funding sections of the grant. We never want to do any of that, and we really try and support our grantees the best way possible so that we don't get to that point. But if there are, major issues, that is something you should just be aware of that is part of any grant. So, accessing the grant application. Like I said, we're using the Enterprise Grants Management System. Here is the address, grants.ossi.dc.gov. And all applicants need credentials. DCPS applications have to go through central office. So teachers, principals, school-based staff, you can't get credentials and you cannot submit an application. So you got to leave yourself enough time to get in touch with DCPS and make sure that they are aware that you need them to submit an application for you, and you have to submit your central data section. So for non-DCPS schools, your central data section is going to have your DUNS number, your SAM expiration date, and those are things that not everybody knows or has, so you want to leave yourself enough time to apply for those. If you are using a fiscal sponsor to funnel your money through and to support you, make sure that they know that they know this information. Has to go through. We did have one school last year who used their farm as their fiscal sponsor, and it was a little bit harder because they didn't have some of this information. So just make sure that when you have that conversation with your fiscal sponsor, they have an opportunity to check out the central data section and understand what they're able, are they able to really do this? So before we get to questions, I am just going to take us on to EGMS really quick, so that you guys can see what I'm talking about. Okay, so your screen is going to look pretty different than mine in general. But let me get to a school so that I can, or an organization, so that I can kind of show you what I'm looking at. So I'm going to use, let's see, we'll use EL Haynes. I think I can get to theirs. So when you sign on, this is what you're going to see when you're logged in and everything. there's going to be a space up here where it says select your fiscal year. You're going to want to select 2016. And then there's two sections. There's created and there's available grants. So created are going to be applications that you have started, and it could be my grant, it could be any other grant with OSSI. And available are the grants that are available through OSSI. And they're all put in, is it a formula grant, is it a competitive grant? So the farm field trip grant is going to be a competitive grant. So you're going to want to look under competitive grant for when you're looking for it. These little, they're called chevrons, these little triangles right here are how you get the information to pop up. So if you click on the chevron, it opens up the information. So, you can see E.L. Haynes had 2 applications in here they had an elementary application and a high school application for the farm field trip grant. And you'll have the buttons that you'll see when you do it under available are like create an application. You'll have to put in the application name. And then once you're a grantee, we do a training so you can understand how to use the system for payments and all that kind of stuff. So I am just going to open up one of their applications here, just so you can see the structure of what this looks like. So what's traditionally like an RFA with us, where you would download a PDF offline, all that information is now in here. So there's 2 sets of tabs, your top level tabs and then your sub tabs is your second one. So every time you change a top level tab, you'll get new sub tabs if there are them. Sometimes it's just one, sometimes it's not. So if you're in background information, you really want to read through that. That's like the bulk and the meat of what the grant is about. So the general information, eligibility, award, program requirements, review process and scoring, everything that we just went through, but in a lot more detail. Your narrative and your contact information is where you're going to put in the most of your information here. So there's school information, applicant information, and then if you choose to use a fiscal sponsor, the fiscal sponsor information should be there as well. You'll have to go through and provide an overview. You'll want to write more than's written in here. Our grantees this year just got grandfathered into using EGMS, so we just quickly input pieces of their application so they don't have full applications. So you'll want to do a full project summary here. One thing that'll be different next year is that there'll be no proposed date. We're just going to ask you whether it's a spring or a fall trip, because we know that picking an exact date before you actually get the money is really hard. So then each of those scoring criteria that we talked about, there's a section for the narrative for you to fill out. So you'll be able to answer a number of questions and you can go in and see those. You'll also have to do a budget. So there's an overview, but then you'll want to put in, do you need any professional services and any supplies and materials? You probably are not buying equipment. Equipment is usually like a very high cost. So I would say generally your expenses are going to go under professional services, which may be the bus transportation and the payment fee that you're paying to the farm for their instruction. And then supplies and materials are going to be anything for your follow-up activity, unless you're contracting someone to come in and do nutrition education. But and then you'll have a budget summary and a cost summary. And there's some checks and balances in there about whether you meet the 70%, 30% rule for your funding being allocated towards your field trip and your follow-up activity. You'll want to make sure you fill out the assurances and you're checking the box under each of these tabs. And then the last thing you do is you're going to go into the Submit tab. And what you will see is a button that says Consistency Check. And that Consistency Check button is the first thing you'll want to hit when you're ready to submit your application. That will scroll through your entire application and see if you're missing anything. And then it'll pop up and say, you're missing X, Y, and Z. So then go back, you fix those, you run the consistency check again. Once the consistency check comes back all clear, you'll get a new button that pops up that says Submit to OSSI. Click that button and your application has been submitted. That's it. We get a notification. We can send it to readers at that point. So that's EGMS. Does anybody have any questions while I'm in here? Okay, it doesn't look like we have any questions right now, so that's good. So I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint and just leave this up here. So at this point, we are done with the presentation. I will stay on here, probably for about 15 more minutes and wait and see if questions pop up. If you are a charter school or a fiscal sponsor and you want to go onto the EGMS website, I'll scroll back and get that website for you and request credentials while we're sitting here and make sure you can walk yourself through that. I'm happy to answer any questions. If you do have credentials and you want to log in and take a look at the RFA and ask questions while I'm here, happy to do that as well. And if you are a DCPS school and you're looking to apply and you're not going to use a fiscal sponsor, I would suggest going onto our website. If you Google OSSE Farm to School program, it's the first one that pops up. And you can download the RFA and there'll be the email for the information you need to get in touch with whoever in central office to do your grant. So if you have no questions, you're welcome to leave. This webinar has been recorded and I will be posting it online so other people can watch if they didn't have a chance to participate. So if you do forget or you want to go back, feel free to do that. And then I will email out the slides to everybody before we exit out today. You're welcome, whoever said thank you. Still here if anyone has any questions.